Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming down. It's a beautiful spot to see Sydney. We've got a fantastic panel today, and hopefully you guys will learn a little bit more about what it takes to make it in the music biz. I might we'll just quickly do some introductions. My name's Dan Rosen. I'm Chief Executive of ARIA and PPCA, which are two peak bodies for recorded music here in Australia. And we've got a fantastic panel today. To my left, I'll let you guys introduce yourself and let us know the last song that you heard before you came into the room. Could have been this morning, last night, or as you came up in the elevator.
Yeah, cool. Hey everyone, my name's Alfresh the Lion. I'm a hip-hop artist from Southwest Sydney. Full-time musician for the past 3 years. Southwest Sydney, represent. The last song I heard on the way in was actually a song by a hip-hop artist from Mumbai called Divine. He's got a song called Azadi, which means freedom. So I was listening to this morning.
Cool.
Hi, my name's Renee Williamson. I'm a program manager at Korea Radio, Gadigal Information Services. I'm also artist manager, Black Side Management, and I present and produce the Indie Hip Hop Show. And the last song that I heard, I can't remember because my mind's just been a blur this morning. So I'm going to say the last song that stuck with me, and that's a track by a local Indigenous MC called Kobe D, called Jody, and it's absolutely amazing.
Hi, I'm Nicola Morton. I'm a musician, and I work in a couple of community engagement music programs at Information and Cultural Exchange in Parramatta in Western Sydney. And I guess I really want to say it. The song that I listened to just on the train just before I got here was by a local artist, Angie, Blood in My Eyes. It's a great album. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name's Vicki. I'm the founding director of the Australian Women in Music Awards, and I do a lot of different things in various capacities as a creative producer. I've worked in the music industry a long time, and the last song that I was listening to was a song called This One Be Killer, which is a dedication to all of our sisters, and performed and sung by Renee and Queen G.
All right, I have a 2.5-year-old, so this morning I was listening to the Wiggles. Nice. Local artists, and they're awesome. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background before we get into the panel, to give a bit of a macro context about where the music industry's come from and where it is today, and then we can look at the macro and then kind of dive into the micro a little bit. So we are 20 years this year from when Napster first came out. Napster came out in 1999. Some of you are probably too young to remember it. But it revolutionised the music business and really set the path for the digital disruption that's over the last 2 decades. So Napster came out in 1999. The iTunes Music Store came out in Australia in 2005. The iPod came out in 2001. So there were 4 years where the only way that you could fill your iPod was through pirated music. People forget that when they say how great Apple was, but it wasn't great for a few years. Spotify launched here in 2012. Digital sales finally eclipsed physical sales in 2014. So it took 15 years after Napster for more digital to sell physical. And then in 2017, streaming became the dominant way for recording artists to make their money here in Australia and around the world. If we have a look at global record sales, from 1999 to 2014, the industry declined year on year and effectively halved. So when Napster came in, piracy took over, and the money coming back to recording artists really fell and almost halved. The good news is the last few years, that's starting to grow again as people start signing up to streaming services. We'll see in Australia, in good news, the revenue that is coming back to the recording industry has grown year on year for the last 4 or 5 years. This is a fascinating stat. So in 2014, less than 10% of the money that was coming back to recording artists was made from streaming services. 4 years later, it was 71%. Think about that. In 2012, 2013, it was 0, and in 2019, it's the largest source. So it shows the pace of change in our industry, that a source of revenue that didn't exist 5 years ago is now the main source of recording industry revenue. So a very big change in our business. And I think that comes down to how many songs can people carry around. We talked about what song we listened to this morning. In 1999, you would have had to own that song on a CD. You could walk around with young people would remember a CD, Sony Discman, and 15 songs in your pocket. Then when the iPod came out, their tagline was 1,000 songs in your pocket. You can have 1,000 songs. Today, on Spotify, which you could sign up for free, you have access to 50 million songs. The entire history of recorded music is effectively at your disposal at any time. You can listen to Beethoven, Beatles, Beyonce, or Wiggles. But it's a lot of music there, and that changes the paradigm when local artists are trying to compete. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The other big change over the last decade is social media, and how YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and others have started changing the conversation. What often gets lost when we talk about these social platforms is that music was the main driver of the take-up of a lot of these platforms. Of YouTube, 19 of the top 20 most viewed videos of all time are music videos. So I think there's one animation called Misha the Bear that's a Russian animation. Other than that, all music videos. 7 of the top 10 most followed people on the planet on Twitter are musicians. So musicians and music really help drive the take-up of these social media platforms. And we've worked very hard to make sure that they now start protecting artist copyright and paying money back to the artist when new music is used on these platforms. I like this story, but just in July 1991, INXS played Wembley Stadium. It took them 15 years, 6 tours, 5 albums in order to get to number 1 all around the world with their album Kick and play to stadiums. 20 years later, in 2001, Gautier, a Melbourne artist, Wally DeBacker, uploaded a video to YouTube and went number 1 around the world without having to leave the country. Showed you the power of these platforms when they're used to harness our music and take our music to the world. And I think that's where we sit today. We are creating local content, but we're existing with global platforms. In music, there are really 4 platforms that dominate. Google, which owns YouTube, Amazon, which just launched in Australia, Apple Music and Spotify. They can get your music not just to Australians, but all around the world. The opportunity is that we're now no longer limited to the 25 million people in Australia. There are 2 to 3 billion people who are on these services around the world. That's the opportunity. The challenge is we're competing now against the whole world and 50 million songs, and it's harder to potentially grow our local market. But that's the market that we need to work in. So I think I just want to set that as a context. That's what's going on around. That's the reality. The question for us now is, well, how do we create sustainable careers for our local artists, our local managers and our local labels? Before we get started, hands up who's an artist in the audience. Hands up who's a manager. And who's label, publisher, and just general interest in music or media.
Good one.
Cool. All right, so it's a pretty diverse bunch of people. And all of those things. That's probably what you need to be these days. Well, Elfresh, how did you first get into the music business, and how have you seen it change in your time?
Yeah, man, it's a good question. I started making and writing songs at about 14 years old. I'm 30 now, so, it takes me a while back. And, my first method of distributing my music was CD. And so it was like from the house. So it was burning CDs and doing my own graphic design. And, you'd make about 20 or 30 copies, and my outlet was my high school. So that was how it started for me. Then, I kind of got introduced to some of the online platforms, which I don't know if they're still running now. So like there was a website I can't even remember the name of it, but there was a website, it was like a chart-based website, and it had different genres and stuff like that. You could make a profile, upload your music, and it's kind of like SoundCloud, but I can't remember the name of it. It'll come to me later. I think SoundClick or something, or I don't know. It'll come to me later. But yeah, so that was like the first kind of method of digital distribution, but it wasn't monetized in any way at that point. It was just trying to get it out there, and it was MySpace. So, you know, the journey, I've kind of seen the journey. I mean, I was kind of post-vinyl, so, you know, I didn't have that experience with that transition from vinyl to CD, but it was CD to digital. To now I'm at a point where it's like the conversation I'm having with my label about music is, do we even press CDs? You know, so, you know, the release of music has changed. I think I've felt and seen the change and the rapid change in the industry between albums. So I've released 2 albums. So the strategy that we went by for the first album differed a lot from the second album. And, you know, what we're about to do is differing a lot from, you know, the second album. So, you know, and that's in the span of 5 years.
Yeah, well, if you think about it, 5 years ago, streaming was virtually zero, and it's now 3/4 of the business. So you would have to be adjusting the strategy as you go. Renee, what about for yourself, working with different artists? How have you, over the course of your career, seen these changes manifest?
Well, I guess not so much career-wise, but I go back to the days of the mixtapes. So, you know, like actual cassettes, and, you know, the pain of the pencil and sticky tape and putting your tapes back together. I'm a person that really loves. I say that I really love the physical product. But that being said, nowadays, if somebody gives me a physical product, I don't necessarily get to utilise it at all, because it's just all, I need it to be really quickly. So I need to be able to play it on my computer or play it on my phone. So yeah, I guess I've seen a really big transition from tapes, vinyl. Vinyl kind of phased out before tapes did, to CD, to now CDs being irrelevant, vinyl coming back in. And being a physical presence of music that people do still buy, to the age of streaming. And, you know, I've seen with the artists that I work with, is like, you know, that dilemma of do you press CDs, like you've said, because it can just seem like a waste of money. But there's also genres and areas where it's not. And it's very much about knowing your market. Like country music, if you're a country music artist, spend money on CDs. Like, do it, you'll sell them. Like, if you're a good artist and you have the audience to buy it. Whereas, like, you know, for hip hop and that now, I just go, don't worry about it. Just don't do it. It's all streaming or digital downloads to get it. And if you're going to go anywhere, potentially look at vinyl. So yeah, I was very anti-streaming, digital music for a long time, and now I'm actually a fan of Spotify.
You and Taylor Swift have to change your tune.
I've really changed my tunes. So and I think I don't think we've reached a spot where we can become complacent yet. I think, you know, like as you've just mentioned, like the industry has changed so much in a short period of time. Like it's the people that are staying ahead of the game and thinking forward that are going to benefit the most from growth and innovation.
Nicola?
Well, my first professional job in the music industry was as a music writer for a time off, like a street press in Brisbane, and that was in print, but now it's like themusic.com.au.
Okay.
So like, of course, like I went through that change, and as well, I've worked in online marketing for Fox for music sales, and now and my job then was like with iTunes, very like. It had already streamlined our job, like to the extreme where like everyone was getting fired and stuff like that. But also just with like iTunes not being around anymore as well, it totally affects that market. But it's not all doom and gloom, I feel, in the music industry perspective. Sure, there's like these figures that are declining, but I feel like there's a lot of hope on the ground, because just talking from my perspective of working in Western Sydney, we have a lot of young artists and musicians coming through, and they're looking for community and support, and so like they're looking for community support to like make music as well as to promote it and put it out there. And I feel like that's my main focus now, is like to support like artists coming through that were once marginalised. I feel like now there's room in the music industry for everyone. I feel like that's a global change that you can't put like in numbers or in a chart. Like it's something that people are feeling on the ground, and I feel like it's really reflected in this panel.
Yeah. Well, certainly the traditional gatekeepers are no longer there, and if something is getting traction, it will become obvious because it'll be there.
Chill.
Vicki, you've gone through probably a few different iterations of the music business in different incarnations, so you've seen it up close in a whole lot of different ways.
So I started performing when I was 8. I was born in New Zealand, and I started performing as 8, and music for me was always a healing thing. I came from a very dysfunctional, broken family, and music for me, as I know it is for many others and some of you in the room, many of you in the room probably, is a process with which you connect to community, and then where you feel like you have a place in the world and where you can feel valued. And I think, so I started performing when I was 8, and I left New Zealand when I was 19 with $300 in my guitar to come to Australia to get a job in the Australian music industry, and I knew no one. And you know, I haven't really looked back actually, but I certainly, as a musician, I went through the whole sort of analogue period. I performed a lot in feminist punk bands in Queensland, and we were recording on, I think, is it half-inch or quarter-inch analogue tape?
Both.
Both?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So we were recording on that, and I was also working with another band in Queensland as well, where we actually recorded on vinyl, and that was in the mid-90s. So we've seen enormous transition, but of course vinyl survived all of that, and obviously the transfer to CDs, etc., and now streaming. But I like you, really, really value the product. I think that there's something very valuable about being able to hold something in your hands, like to have a booklet or a CD. And I still manufacture CDs for that reason. I've just produced a really big women's rock musical, and everybody in the foyer was saying to me, why haven't you put the music, on Spotify? And as if it wasn't something I hadn't thought of. And I didn't do it on purpose, because I actually didn't want that music to be streamed all around the world before we make the feature film. So I do continue to really, really value the pleasure and joy of actual CDs and hardware. I think it's something that we all love, because we all love to hold and touch those things. I think I'd be sad if that was lost, really.
Yeah. I think vinyl's been the real surprise packet. If somebody would have told me 10 years ago that vinyl sales will be increasing year on year, and on the trajectory it's going, vinyl sales will outstrip CD sales in a couple of years, and we'll probably end up with vinyl being the physical format rather than the CD. So that's just shows you that you can't always pick the trends that are going on, and it's not necessarily old people, but it's young kids who are discovering vinyl for the first time, and it's not an either or. They're buying vinyl, but then also listening to it on Spotify and Apple Music and YouTube, but it's able to sit down. And the same way there's a slow food movement, it's almost like a slow music movement where you sit down and listen to an album. Elle, the differing revenue streams as an artist these days, how do you balance that between the recording and the live, and whether it's endorsements or other things? How do you balance that as an artist?
I think on one level you kind of take what you get. On another level, it's very much kind of being, having a holistic approach as an artist. It's recognizing that your value is more than just the song that you make and the song itself. It's understanding that, you are essentially carrying the essence of that song throughout everything that you do, and so that could be, your message, it could be your brand, it could be whatever it may be, and it permeates through your merchandise, through, opportunities that you take up with brands or endorsements or things like that, or finding partnerships and collaborations. I think, having a holistic approach is really important, and it's something that enabled me to make the switch from working part-time or full-time into working in being a full-time career musician. And if I didn't have that holistic approach and I relied just on one thing, and particularly, my biggest passion is making, writing, recording, performing songs. If I just relied on that, then I would struggle for sure, if I tried to make that as a thing on its own. And I think it comes down to, really, having that holistic approach, recognizing that your value is more than just the one thing that you do, but you trying to understand where your other strengths may lie as well, and utilizing them in a variety of different ways, and having a business mindset. If making a career out of music as an artist is something that you're interested in and passionate about, then I think you got to build a skill set as a business person as well.
So give us an example of something that you've done outside of that core writing and producing?
Yeah, for sure. So, I manage a lot of the stuff myself. I have a manager as well, so we kind of both manage the top to bottom of it. So, there's the, entire stuff of like project planning, marketing, having all that kind of skill set. But in terms of more specific stuff outside of the writing and recording songs, so I've also got a skill set and a background in working in workshops and community and stuff like that. So taking that expertise that I've built over 10 years to, be consulting for organizations on how they can be developing programs utilizing music, or, in other specific areas that I might have expertise in, working with brands on consultation or on rollouts of their stuff in conjunction with what my brand represents as well. Those are the kind of things I look at, and also just kind of working with schools and working with young people and the next generation of musicians. I kind of spend a lot of time on that as well. So, there's ways to kind of utilize what you're passionate about in other areas as well. It's kind of just, I think about it as like trying to find the things that are going to sustain me so that I don't have pressure on me when I'm doing the thing I love the most.
Yeah.
So that are going to sustain that, so I don't have to rely on that to sustain itself. Because if I'm worrying about whether this song's going to hit enough for me to be able to afford studio time for the next song, then it's going to put so much pressure on the actual writing of that song. So it's like, okay, well, what else can I do that's going to sustain that? And that way it frees me up to just be doing what I love to do without any pressure.
That's a very good point. Renee, how are you with artists that you see and work with? How are you seeing they're creating a sustainable career in this new digital global world?
You know what? It's hard. And I think it goes back, to what Elle said, but also what I said before about knowing your market, knowing your art, knowing your worth, which is a really big one, I think, and that really plays into not every opportunity that you're going to come across is around money. It's also not about exposure, because exposure doesn't pay the bills. It's about knowing about when you got to weigh it up. You got to weigh up those opportunities. Like, how much is this going to bring to me? How much is it going to cost me? How much am I going to It is a real juggling game, I guess, in terms of knowing that. And artists that I've worked with, I'd say, the struggling artist thing it's a cliche, but it's true. Like, if you really want to be successful in the industry and you're in your art form, unless you come from a really privileged background, you're going to struggle for a bit. And you just have to find a way to weather that storm. And, sometimes it's doing a ridiculous amount of work every day. It's having your job to pay the bills, and then putting, the effort into your art form and doing, a bit longer into the night. And I think it's just a case of just knowing when you're prepared and willing to do that struggle to see the payoff. And I think, it's also about managing expectations, I think, is a big one, especially with managers. because, you know, particularly in hip hop, people think they're going to be living like Rick Ross, I think, after, you know, or Kanye or something, after they've like kind of had a hit that's kind of gone somewhere. It's like, well, one, to kind of, you know, get the legs. You know, the overnight success is so rare. You know, it's the magic bean or whatever. It's putting in the work that's going to get you there, and I think that putting it through and getting there, like even successful artists that you see are not living that celebrity, you know, millions and millions of dollar lifestyles. Like that's again the top kind of big selling artists. And, you know, Australia is also a pretty small industry. So I guess in terms of thinking globally, you know, I guess just being realistic about the financial, I guess, success is a big thing. And, yeah, like doing your work, doing your homework, not just doing your work in terms of your art form, but that business mindset is really important. That's why I think with finding a manager, I also think it's good for artists to have a hand at doing a bit of management themselves. Like most artists will self-manage for a little while, and getting a feel for what is actually involved. And also to managers, I feel, yeah, like we do a lot of work too. We get like a percentage of a cut rather than, you know, the whole amount. So it's not just artists in terms of, you know, making a financially viable career and a successful career, whatever that success means to you. It's also that team that you have around you that need to be in for the, you know, the long run, or to get the results that you want.
Yeah, I think both you guys make excellent points that it's a lot of hustle. You really got to hustle hard. And even the people at the top, Jimmy Barnes has had the #1 album in the country. He worked his butt off that week. You know, you think Jimmy Barnes, it's his 12th #1, and speaking to his manager, said he wanted this more than his 11 others. Like the people at the top don't get there and then sit on their couch and rest. They're still hustling, still working really, really hard. You see it. I'll just talk about Jimmy Barnes because I've seen it this week, but the work ethic is the reason why they get to the top, and that's the only way that you can stay at the top. And your point about understanding a bit about business is whether you end up doing it or not, being able to know when someone's hustling you or ripping you off, it's really important to have a bit of that understanding to know what your value is and what to say yes to and what to say no to. Nicola, what about yourself in terms of that mix of revenue streams to try and have a sustainable career as an artist?
Well, what Elfresh said about like keeping like the musical product holistic, like I totally resonate with that. I feel like it's really evident in the change in our program that we've worked at Information and Cultural Exchange, where we started just with music production and just help with music production. But after 4 years now, we've branched out and we have a new program that deals with management, record label, promotion, music writing, and that's something that like was called for from our artists. Like they want that support as well, and they want to be able to do it themselves. Like to have that diversity in those like management and media areas, I find is also very important. So I feel like it's really we try to think global but act local, and it's just trying to help break down like a lot of the musicians and artists that come through find the music industry quite impenetrable, and we're really trying to break down those barriers, and just through trying to offer more support and like listening to them, like what do you want to learn about, like how can we help you, like who would you like to come talk to you and share their story, share skills. And I feel like that more kind of mentoring allows more access into like the musical area, and like when you have, and it's also in turn generating a different kind of music revenue that's not just a retail product, it's like music service. And I feel like that is what makes the music industry a lot bigger than you might think it is.
Vicki, on that point around helping the next generation of artists come through and mentoring and providing both a healthy ecosystem and a welcoming ecosystem, are you seeing much progress on that front, and where are you seeing artists, some states or cities do it better than others?
I think I think everybody acknowledges that to be successful, you have to be really multi-skilled, and we all have to be multi-skilled in so many different areas. When I was running record labels and I was running independent labels, we had to do everything ourselves. I mean, from everything you're saying, the photography, the video clips, producing the videos, the media, radio servicing, all of those sorts of things. And I think this generation and the people that are coming now behind us are much better at that actually than what we were. I think it's sort of it's almost indicative of the world we live in now, that you have to be able to do a number of different things. Even as a producer myself now, I've always got at least 5 projects I'm managing at any one time. And I've also got another 5 projects out there that I'm pitching at any one time, so that, I can continue to raise my own revenue to support myself, because the work that I do, a lot of the work I do is charity driven, and it doesn't pay the bills. So I'm not on a salary, like a lot of you aren't on salaries. I don't get superannuation. I don't have any of that in my life. So I have to be really, really proactive and, again, really disciplined. It's no different for artists out there who are trying to survive in this world. But I also would go so far to say I think that the things that are most important in our industry, apart from, there is a lot of talk about mentoring at the moment, and I acknowledge that mentoring is important, but the thing that I'm most aware of and most conscious of, particularly with a lot of the women that I work with, is that what they want more than anything is networking. And that what I think people really crave for, and certainly what I crave for when I was younger, was networking, just making those connections with people, because it's through those connections that you actually can create real pathways, I think. And I also think that there are a number of sort of skills and values, I think, that are important in the music industry. I mean, we all have to be prepared to take a certain amount of risk. Risk is really important, because without risk, we actually don't know what our full potential is. We don't know what's actually possible. And some of the scariest things in the world, and believe me, I've confronted a lot of them in the music industry, and I'm still doing it, some of the scariest confrontations are the things that actually you learn the most from and that you grow the most from, because you've actually challenged your own personal limitations, I suppose. So through risk, obviously, we need to have courage, and we also need to have a lot of tenacity. And it's not something, the music industry can be very hard. It's not something for everybody. Tenacity is something you have to have over a lifetime. I just sat on a panel in Brisbane 3 nights ago at the Museum of Brisbane talking about the women's band that I performed in 30 years ago called Spit. And it was really amazing to do that, because for the first time in my life, I realised that I'd actually lived long enough and survived long enough to actually be able to talk about my musical past. So there is that thing too. You have to be able to live a good life and sustain a good life, and treat people really well. Treat people the way you want to be treated. Humility can never be underestimated in our industry, because it is an industry built on ego, out of control ego a lot of the time. So I'm rambling a bit now, but I do think that this generation, your generation, are just so fantastic when it comes to actually working across a whole lot of different areas, because of the way the industry's changed so much. You just have to, don't you?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a new generation coming through who weren't around in the 90s or the 2000s when it was about physical product. They've been born into the digital age and recognise that you need to be really good across all these mediums. And if you think about the great artists of each generation embrace the technology. And, the Beatles and Dylan and those guys in the 60s was when vinyl came along and you could fit a whole album's worth of music on an album. Before that, it was a singles-based market, Sinatra and Elvis Presley in that. It moved into a album-based market, and that became the prevailing art form. The 80s, when the videos came along and MTV, Michael Jackson, Prince, Madonna embraced that format and really took that technology to the next phase. And in today's social media environment, the great artists, Ed Sheeran and Taylor Swift and Kanye and that, they all understand that their art is, yes, it's about creating music, but it's also about having an ongoing conversation with their audience. It's working with the right brands that can help amplify their message. And I think that story about being on the hustle and knowing your worth is really important. In terms of this global marketplace, is that something that you're conscious of now when you're creating, that you're not just limited to hip-hop fans in Australia, but there might be a hip-hop fan in Finland or Vietnam that now can access your music? Is that something that you are trying to aggregate now and market to?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, international is I think for me has kind of always been on a part of the vision and the dream, you know. I think now more than ever, you're kind of able to gauge what might be a good first step. And you're still taking a risk, but it's a calculated risk now because you have all the data to let you know where to go, based on what your back end of your streaming services coming back with, the back end of your stats on your social media, who's engaging with what you're putting out. And, you can take a calculated risk. So, global is definitely in the mindset now. And I think you kind of, I suppose it depends on what you do, right? But for me and my mindset, it's part of the long-term picture. It's part of the what's going to help build a sustainable career for me in the long term. And so for me, it's India. To me that's a no-brainer. And Spotify has just launched in India in recent times as well. Apple's been there.
YouTube is massive in
India.
India.
Oh yeah, YouTube's huge. I think of those YouTube channels you mentioned that are in the top 20 or whatever, I think number one might be an Indian music record label. So the way in which and the amount in which music is consumed globally, you have to pay attention to it. I've got stories of friends who are artists who never had the career or still don't have the careers that they want in Australia, but they've got it in Japan. So they travel out there and they're superstars out there, or the Philippines or Thailand or whatever it might be. So And that's just the nature of the world that we live in. I suppose you go where the demand is, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's important to have that mindset, and I think it's something to think about. Again, it comes back to that strategy idea, that being a person who's tuned into business and to opportunity and to audience and stuff like that. Recognizing where you may be able to have the edge when it comes to having an in. All of those things kind of factor into that global conversation, I think.
Yeah, it's just basic mathematics. We have 25 million people here.
For real, yeah.
If you're in a particular niche of your music, there's only going to be a certain amount of people that you can appeal to. On the planet at the moment, there are somewhere between 2 and 3 billion people attached to a mobile phone who potentially can be your audience. And we're a very multicultural society here, and you see if you can access some of those. For you, India, for others throughout Asia. I also think that America is such a big market that American artists focus on America and English artists focus on Europe and America. And Asia is this growing market that Australia really could focus on, and Australian artists can have great careers there. What about yourself? You're seeing with the Indigenous communities, are we opening up pathways to get that music heard globally?
Yeah, well, I think the pathway's been there for a lot longer than kind of gets recognised, I guess. I think a classic example is possibly Yotha Yindi, but if you go back even further, you look at nobody knew of the Sapphires until the movie, right? But they were touring internationally like it was during wartime, but also artists like Wilma Redding, who had more of a career overseas than she did here. So this is going back 60s, 70s, I think she was in the US. So it's a bit of a funny one with Indigenous music, I feel, because in some ways overseas markets are a lot more open to our musicians than the domestic market. And that comes down to the issues that we have here in Australia. But I also think, like, for instance, my show, the Indie Hip Hop show, we're actually syndicated across North America with Native Voice One. So we already have that international pathway there. Thank you, Mel. And so we've had, we get hit up a lot of times from fans from overseas, but we also have some really good connections, particularly with Canada, because, in terms of cultural stuff with Aboriginal people here and Aboriginal people in Canada, and that First Nations connection, it's really strong. And we've already seen, some of the connections made there with Darwin Festival last year, with RPM and Bad Apples teaming up to do a showcase there, which was fantastic. I think, global. I think, like you said, the US market is a really tough one. I think everybody dreams of cracking the US market, but it's obviously very rare. But, we still have artists that do it. I think, I don't think we can talk about global reach without talking about Sounds Australia and the really great work that they're doing in terms of opening up artists and exposing them to overseas markets. So, I think it's there, and in some ways...
And the positive on Sounds Australia was the first time both parties went to the recent federal election committing to new funding for Sounds Australia, both Liberal and Labor. And so whoever won, we were going to get some funding for music export. So that really shows that both parties have understood this opportunity for our artists to export to the world and how we can continue to help grow that.
Yeah, and I just think it's really, there's a local artist, Dobby, who's just gone over to the Great Escape in the UK. He's getting a great response over there. But I think sometimes it's a little bit, it's like a pipe dream, but it's so hard sometimes to just get your foot in the door and working locally that, overseas we just don't quite get there. But then there's also really great opportunities there. But sometimes they want the cliche representation of what Aboriginality is. So unless you're dark skin and, fit with what they see as an Aboriginal artist, then those markets can close sometimes too, if they're looking for that.
Nicola, what about yourself? Are you having success or having those conversations with the artists that you're working with?
Well, I have a couple of interesting anecdotes to share. Principally because it does just come from trying to build a community locally. Basically, a lot of the artists that come through, they listen to a lot of this international music that you don't see chart on ARIA or I'm always, at the beginning of each of our programs, we have a music share, and I always find new music from music that the artists bring in. And anyway, it's just really simple for them to just hit up who the artists they're listening to. Everyone has a SoundCloud account, or even, and you can basically hit them up and say, hey, we really like your music, blah, blah, blah. And this is my music. What do you think? We really encourage them to, again, further that mentoring program, mentoring notion from just in person to it can be international. If you have a similar community or a similar music, it is just as comprehensible to message someone and say, I really like your music, what do you think of mine, blah, blah, blah. And that's how you create an international network. Plus, at another Music New South Wales seminar we had with Kimchi Princhi, she told an amazing story of how this Korean nightclub just contacted her from her SoundCloud and were we really love your music, we just want you to play our club one night. And she just flies in and plays for a phenomenal fee and comes back. And it's just that spontaneity that's there in the internet that some people forget about sometimes, that you can just immediately contact someone, and if they're up for it, they'll reply.
Yeah. You never know where it's going to come from. That spark that might light something. One other issue I think that's been rising to prominence over the last few years, and it's taken a long time, and Vicki, you've been at the start of it, is is the diversity of the industry. Vicki, up until last November, was one of 2 ever female ARIA board members in our 35-year history, and I'm pleased to say that we were able to get the constitution change last year, and we now have 4 new female board members on the ARIA board, and a female observership program, and now all of the ARIA committees are gender balanced, and the board itself. But still a lot of work to be done, and I'm just interested in your thoughts how the industry is going on that journey. Progress is being made, but still work to be done.
Well, I've been lobbying for gender and cultural equity in the Australian music industry for about 30 years. And it's only last year we managed to establish the inaugural Australian Women in Music Awards. We are committed to acknowledging and recognising the contributions of women, First Nations women and multicultural women, diverse women, across all areas of industry. So not just singer-songwriters, but those women that are working in tech areas, managers, producers, video makers, photographers, journalists, etc., etc. The journey around inclusivity in the music industry has been very, very difficult. It's been a very, very, very long road, and it is still a long road. We've still got a really long way to go, and that's for all women in the music industry. I mean, I would love, at some point, Dan, it would be amazing if these women were interested for there to be a First Nations woman on the board of ARIA. And that's something that actually needs to happen. Whilst we talk about the struggles of non-Indigenous women or women in general, you can be damn sure that the struggles for our First Nations sisters is a lot harder than ours. So these conversations are really, really important, and the Women in Music Awards is a really great platform to put a whole lot of that on the table and to create a really broad community to actually have some truth-telling with one another, which is most needed and very, very welcome. But in terms of the struggle, I think it's an ongoing thing. I mean, if we look at, I always say, if we look at, women didn't get the vote in Australia till 1901, and we still don't have equality in government. Some people have said to me, so Vicki, you know, what are you going to do when you don't need the Australian Women in Music Awards anymore? Well, it's like, well, it ain't going to happen in my lifetime that we're going to have equity. We don't have equal pay. We're still seeing extraordinary levels of sexual harassment and assault happening on women at festivals. Yeah, we need more Jacinda Ardern, don't we? Yeah. And I think there are a lot of challenges just in terms of empowering women to work in what we used to say were non-traditional roles. So those non-traditional roles meaning the roles that men have traditionally filled, not to say that we want to take those jobs, but what we want is to create equal opportunity for women who are interested in technical areas, interested in production, want to be sound engineers, want to be drummers, want to be artist managers, want to run record labels, etc., want to be industry leaders, are industry leaders. We need to create opportunity for those women to actually step up and gain the skills that they need to work in those areas. And that's across all areas of diversity as well, including all of the First Nations women that we work with. So I know I'm rambling a bit, Dan, but
yeah.
I think there's an enormous amount of work to do. We've only just really started. I think the Women's Music Awards has been received so well. We opened nominations yesterday, by the way, for 2019. Within 24 hours, we've had 100 nominations. So I'm just putting a plug in there, go in there and please nominate, and you can self-nominate too. But I think that what's always been very clear to me is that whenever I've developed or produced a program in an area of the music industry that women have least access to, they are always the most successful programs. Always. So when I was producing, I set up the Australian Women's Rock Institute in the early 90s, and we ran a major rock festival, again with the same principles, inclusive, working with First Nations artists, working with multicultural women, diverse. We were doing it then, we're still doing it now. Not a lot's changed, but what has changed is that the Women in Music Awards has created a platform to have a positive conversation in a celebratory sense around where women are achieving. And that's the most important thing, that we need to be able to empower women to feel good about what they're doing and to feel acknowledged and recognised for their great contributions, which have been completely, almost completely, ignored historically in the Australian music industry.
Well said. Elle, just in terms beyond gender, but in like other cultures, and it's where I remember last year's ARIA masterclass, we had Zane Lowe come over and host a panel that we called The New Australia that Briggs was on and some others, and I think everybody up there was first generation, kids of migrants, and definitely a different face of Australian music. Have you seen that change? Are you still seeing barriers to that in your journey?
Yeah, man, this is a real interesting conversation on multiple different levels. I think generally speaking, in a broader sense, what's happening in the music industry is, like a microcosm of what's happening nationally anyway, in all sectors. So, this conversation about the need to break down barriers and have access points is a bigger conversation nationally, in all sectors. I think hip-hop's an interesting one, if I bring it back to that for what I've seen, because hip-hop has always been inclusive, has always been diverse. And so, and it always has had a community, a strong community feel to it. So at a grassroots level, especially in Western Sydney, for as long as I can remember, hip-hop has been diverse. It's just the faces that we've seen at a successful mainstream or commercial level have not been reflective of that. And that's changed over the years. And I think, a large part of that is just that hip-hop mentality of, we don't give a shit, like we're just gonna break down the doors anyway, whether you hold the barriers up, like eventually it's gonna crack. So, credit to all the artists who are now being recognized to their persistence, and to the artists who've come before them who did the hard yards and were not recognized for their work, because, but for them that, artists like myself wouldn't be able to be in the position that I'm in now. And so, that goes to groups like Southwest Syndicate from, the area, talking about crews that paved the ways for me to be able to be where I am today. So, the barriers still exist for sure. And, I really resonate with what was mentioned earlier, in terms of like in Western Sydney, the barriers for artists and access and entry points and all of that stuff is real, is very real. And it's something that I still see and get feedback from artists in the area. And, my solution in conversations that I've been pitching to a lot of music industry has been like, you need to come to Western Sydney, like kill two birds with one stone. Like you want to solve part of your diversity problem, come to Western Sydney and set up shop there. And employ people from the area, like you're really going to start to break down a bunch of different barriers and, be in an exciting place anyway. So I think, there's resistance to when I mention that a lot of the times. People are like, oh yeah, but we already committed this year to maybe in the future. It's like, well, the future's now. Come on, like hurry up. Like let's make it happen, because there's the reality of it is there's people in the area who, are struggling. Like music, I think about it in this way when it comes to people from cultured backgrounds as well. There tends to be like from what I've seen in Southwest Sydney anyway, and it's not just people from cultured backgrounds, but all people from Southwest Sydney is like there's a mentality around like music is not a luxury. It's not something that is like just a hobby. It's like your means of survival. And I mean that on like in terms of like a mental state, in a spiritual sense, and in a material sense, So like for the kids that I'm seeing at the school I work with in Miller, it's like this is everything for them. And the reality of actually making it in the music industry, whatever that may be, is so difficult because the barriers are so real and so present that they don't see the opportunities and options in front that they have because they're very limited. So it can be a really tough place to kind of have these conversations when you're trying to tell people to persist, keep going. Like when like they rely on this for so much. It's not just I make good music because I like making music. It's like I make music because this is what gets me out of bed in the morning, literally and spiritually. So it's a bit of a different mindset. But yeah, those barriers still exist. They're being broken down. And a lot of credit has to go to all the artists who are, and people in the industry who've been working for a long time, 30 plus years, and to try to knock those barriers down. But like's been said, we got a long way to go. And from a hip hop perspective, good luck trying to hold any of us back.
Given that we're here under the auspices of Create New South Wales and part of Vivid, which is government funded, I thought it'd be interested in talking about how whether it's local councils or government grants and the like. I know that Music New South Wales at the moment have a grant program available up on their website, I think up to $5,000 for artist grants that are available to go to, whether it's on tour or to applying for overseas festivals and the like, so that's definitely worth checking out. They've also got a funding calendar. There's a lot of funding opportunities, not a lot, mate, there could always be more, but there's quite a lot that goes on at a national level. For example, PPCA, which I also look after, we just announced today we do a recording grant each year where we offer 5 artists $15,000 to record an album together with the Australia Council. Our first year, 5 years ago, we gave a recording grant to an artist called Courtney Barnett, who ended up using that $15,000 to go and win a whole bunch of ARIAs, a Brit Award, and play on every festival around the world. So, you can really, $15,000 can go a long way, and it's worth going on that funding calendar to see what's available. But I'm interested, for you guys, how are you seeing working with governments and local councils? Are they attuned to what's happening in the local industry? How do we improve that? Mike Stark, you've worked with Queensland government quite closely.
Well, I guess I've worked and been getting money out of government for years, different governments. But I think that the challenge for us actually in Australia is that because the arts have such a struggle with the arts, not just music, but with the arts. And I think we have a real struggle around some leadership in those positions as well, because we obviously in Australia you make more money by kicking a football around a football field than you ever will by being an artist. And I think there needs to be a broader conversation always and constantly, an ongoing conversation with government around the importance of creativity and why we need to be investing in creativity and what that actually means for us as individuals, as human beings, as spiritual people. What does it actually mean for our own survival on the planet? As far as working with government, I learned at the age of 25, really young, how to get grants out of government, and I've been doing it ever since. And it's not easy.
Do you want to share a secret?
It's not easy, and there've been plenty of times where I've not been successful.
Yeah.
And I think it's become even harder because as the dollar has shrunk for the arts and particularly for music, there's just not so much money to go around. So it actually puts pressure on all of us to writing grant applications, who wants to do that?
Yeah.
And who wants to acquit them once you've actually done the grant application? I mean, they do my head in. I spend my life, actually, I reckon at least a quarter of my year, it'd be the same for you, quarter of my year writing applications, not knowing whether they're going to be funded, having a nervous breakdown when they're not funded, finding enough courage to write a new application and get funding again. Then you get funded, then you've got to do the project, and then you've got to acquit it, and then you've got to apply again. I mean, it's just absolutely crazy. I don't understand. And I don't know any sports people who have to do that. Do you? I don't know, Dan. I think
it's probably other than the footy players, some of the smaller sports have to. I do think there's an increased recognition. It was the first time, as I said, the first time ever that both major parties took a contemporary music strategy to an election, and that's been a huge amount of work from a lot of people around the music industry to start explaining to our policymakers that music is, like sport, one of the big passion points for Australian music. The only thing that fills a stadium in this country is a sporting event or a music event. More people in Victoria, which freaked out the policymakers, more people went to see live music than the AFL. And the AFL is it's a religion in Melbourne. But we haven't been very good at telling our story to governments, to explaining how important this is to the Australian culture and that they have to invest in it. We're quite on time, but Nicola, you've probably worked with local councils and governments. Any tips that you can tell them?
We've been funded by local and state governments, but what I've found is that a lot of artists, especially from culturally and socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds, have a lot of trouble like applying for grants. And it's the way that it's set up where they pit each individual against each individual in a battle royale situation that really that makes it basically even worse. And like we've pioneered this kind of artist-run collective, similar to like an artist-run initiative, like in visual arts, but we have done this in music, where we have an artist-run collective, and they all work together. Like, and for them, it has made it a bit easier to like look at a grant, but like we need to have more discussions with the state and with all of the government funding to allow more of this like a collective application process rather than this individual process. I feel it makes it easy, like with the diversity conversation we were having earlier. There needs to be a little, if you've got to have a look at who's getting, if it isn't working, why isn't it working, and just go from there.